I've always loved books, as far back as I can remember. When I was 3, I taught myself to read by memorising the Oxford English Dictionary, every single word. Of course, I didn't understand the explanations on what most of the words meant, but I memorised them all. Then I started pestering every adult I could find to try and understand the meanings. At home, on the way to hospital or school, the families of the other children in hospital, everyone, just trying to find out what these words meant, and then I'd memorise people's explanations of them. I've always loved books. We'd moved into a new house, and the previous tenants had left an alcove full of books in what was to be my new bedroom. Absolutely chock-a-block full of books. By the time I was 4, I must have read about 70 novels. I don't know how many dictionaries, encyclopedias, art books, history books, you name it, I'd read them all several times. In fact, I used to love climbing up the bookcase, even though I was up to my neck in plaster half the time. I'd take all the books from the bottom shelf when I'd finished reading them, carry them up, put them on the top shelf, and climb up to read them from the top. And then keep rotating the books so I could keep climbing to the top shelf to read something. And then jumping down onto my bed and bouncing on the bed. That was my introduction to reading and to art as well. But having read all the material several times, I was getting a bit bored and hungry for some new work, something new to read. The occasional newspaper that came in the house didn't really cut it, although I was intrigued by the newspaper strips and started copying those, learning how to draw from them. But no, hardly any new books. My mum read Agatha Christie, and only Agatha Christie, but once was enough for me, and I hadn't quite cottoned on that these Agatha Christie books were coming from a library. Didn't know there was such a thing at the time. So I had to come up with something fresh, and that was how I learned how to write stories. Although to start with, it was kind of mix and match. When I say mix and match, it was kind of like William Burroughs' cut-up technique, though I'd never heard of him at the time. I would take a couple of books, tear out the pages, cut them into strips, paragraphs, sentences, individual words sometimes, rearrange them, come up with a new story. My first attempt at this was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea meets Alice in Wonderland, which was quite an intriguing take. I then went on to other novels, The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, combined with various esoteric books that I found in the alcove, including works by Mishima. I think it was Temple of the Golden Pavilion. Very strange for a 4-year-old to be reading, but there you go. And just created these whole new storylines with mixing and matching using cut-up. Considering I was only 4.5, I was quite systematic in my working process. Before I progressed to a whole novel, I started with just one page. I think it was page 12 from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I'll say page 12 on one side, page 13 on the other. Tore that out and then cut it into individual lines and strips. And then I alternated the lines. So you had, first line was from page 12, second line flipped over for page 13, back to page 12, then for 13, through the whole page. See how that read. If I didn't like it, I then tried something different. Maybe every third line I would flip. Sometimes I would cut the line in half and flip half the line or the other line and then try that. Just trying out different things to see what sounded right. It wasn't even a case of what made sense. It was just what sounded interesting. And once I got a feel for that, I would then move on to the next page, and eventually I did the whole novel. Once I'd finished doing that process, I'd paste up the lines onto big sheets of paper and then copy them all out, longhand, into a notebook till I had the whole novel. Ridiculously time consuming, but considering between hospital and occasionally time at school when I was just starting school, I had a lot of time on my hands, and this is how I used it. The next stage was to illustrate the book. So After my early attempts at pen and ink, using watercolour and still playing around with crayon, I came up with about, I think, 35 illustrations for this new book that was basically 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea versus Alice in Wonderland. Actually, I've just remembered, my very first attempt at mixing and matching was not 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea with Alice in Wonderland. That was my second attempt. It was actually The Creature from the Black Lagoon with Alice in Wonderland. And I didn't have a book of that, but I saw the film on telly, and since I had a photographic memory, I was able to transcribe all the dialogue and then write descriptive passages. I then got copies of Famous Monsters of Filmland and used that for reference to do the illustrations. And of course I had Alice in Wonderland with John Tenniel's illustrations, so that was actually my first attempt. I then progressed on to writing my own original ideas, stories, comic strips, and wrote my first novel. It's more like an illustrated novella, really. It was called The House in the Forest, and was sort of influenced by Japanese fairy tales, sort of with Hansel and Gretel via Hammer's House of Horror. So it was quite a strange little mix. But that was my very first original writing. My dad, he was the first of his generation of his family to be able to read or write. But interestingly, he never took that much interest. He'd read the newspaper, but that was it. I never saw him in my life ever read a book. He never read a novel. He never even read a manual. But he obviously could. He just no interest. And it may have been to do with, I know he had mental health issues. He abused both me and my sisters when we were children. But no interest in books, and he obviously seemed quite intimidated by my reading and writing, especially when I was so young and I had a photographic memory, and I would quote back huge chunks from novels I'd read or TV programmes I'd watched, word for word. And I think this freaked him out a bit. He already had this impression that I was the devil's child, and was something not right with me. And I think the photographic memory and writing all these novels and stuff as a kid just was too much for him. I realised I was getting to the point where I knew he was probably going to come and start destroying everything I'd done and all my books. I had a couple of books under my bed, under the mattress, and my Auntie Susie, who was very supportive of what I was doing, came around one day when he was at work and rescued some of my favourite books and took them to her place. So I'd still have access to them when I went to visit her. But sure enough, he turned up one day, took all my writings, my cut-up stuff, all the books off the shelves, and had a huge bonfire in the back garden, burnt the lot. I thought I got away with the books that I had under the mattress, but he eventually found those, and one of them was one of my favourite books was Arthur Rackham Fairy Tales, and I remember the day he found that one, and he gave it to my sister and told her to take it out to the backyard and tear it up in front of me. And my sister was quite young and also had learning difficulties, so she didn't really know what was going on. She probably thought it was a game. But she very meticulously tore each page up into strips and then into little squares and made a very neat pile on the back step and then put them on the bonfire in the back garden. I was upset, to say the least, and the fact that he was doing it, he was my sister, to sort of do this was quite upsetting. But I kind of got what I felt was some justice, because within 3 days of this happening, it was on the news on the telly that the first edition of this particular book had just sold at Sotheby's, I think for something like $500,000. But of course he hadn't really destroyed anything. I had a photographic memory, and he couldn't take away that from me. He couldn't take away the memories, the words, the images that I'd got from all those books. Those were going to stay with me forever. And that just strengthened my resolve, to love books even more and to create them myself.